400 ears of corn. That's what one Aztec family accepted in exchange for their daughter during the famine of 1454, and by the time the drought finally broke, thousands of families across the empire had made a version of that same trade. Here's why that number should stop you. This wasn't kidnapping. It wasn't war. A person walked into a market, alive and free, and walked out someone else's property, and the whole transaction was completely legal. So what kind of system allows that? And what happened to the people caught inside it? That's the question this documentary is going to answer, using the accounts of Spanish friars who interviewed Aztec elders within living memory of the empire's collapse, and the codices those elders helped produce. Start with the basics, because almost none of them match what the word slavery usually conjures. The Aztecs called an enslaved person a tlacotli, plural, tlacotin, and the very first fact about them breaks the pattern found in nearly every other slaveholding society in history. You could not be born into it. A tlacotli's children were free citizens from the moment of birth, full stop, no exceptions recorded in the sources we have. Whatever this institution was, it wasn't a permanent underclass passed down through generations. It reset with every child. That single detail already separates Aztec slavery from Rome, from the transatlantic trade, from nearly everything Europeans meant when they used the word. But it raises an immediate question. If nobody was born into it, how did anyone end up there at all? 3 ways, according to the Florentine Codex, compiled by the friar Bernardino de Sahagún, working directly from Nahua informants. Crime, debt, and economic desperation so severe that self-sale looked like the only path forward. Crime is the most straightforward. Certain offenses, including repeated theft and failure to pay taxes, carried enslavement as a sentence, with the sale price applied directly against whatever was owed. Debt worked similarly. Gambling losses, unpaid obligations, and inability to support yourself could all end with a formal transaction in the marketplace. 4 official witnesses required by law to make it valid. But the famine years are where the system gets genuinely hard to look away from. Between 1450 and 1454, 4 consecutive crop failures hit the Valley of Mexico. Granaries emptied. According to the Codex Ramirez and later Spanish accounts, families began selling themselves and their children to communities on the Gulf Coast, where the Huaxtec and Totonac peoples still had food to trade. A young woman's price during those years, roughly 400 ears of maize. Parents sold children. Husbands and wives reportedly sold each other, with an understanding that whoever remained free would try to buy the other back once the harvests recovered. That detail alone tells you this wasn't simple exploitation. It was survival math, played out by people with almost no other options. Which brings up the part of this story that scholars still argue about. Sahagún himself, writing in the 16th century, questioned whether slavery was even the right word for what he was documenting. And it's easy to see why once you look at what a tlacotli's life actually involved. Owners were legally obligated to feed, house, and clothe the people they held. A tlacotli could own property, could own a home, could marry a free citizen, could, remarkably, own slaves of their own. And an owner couldn't simply sell a tlacotli against their will unless that person had already been formally warned for laziness or disobedience, in front of witnesses, more than once. If a tlacotli believed they were being mistreated, they had a legal option most people don't associate with any slave system in world history. They could run to the ruler's palace during a religious festival. If they reached it before being caught, custom held that they earned their freedom on the spot, and anyone who tried to block that escape could be enslaved themselves as punishment. Compare that to the plantation systems Europeans would build in the same hemisphere, less than a century later, and the contrast is almost impossible to reconcile. Same continent, same word in translation, 2 completely different institutions. If you're finding this as strange as I did researching it, that's the reaction most people have the first time they actually look past the word slavery and into how the system functioned day to day. Subscribe if you want more documentaries that dig past the surface-level version of history most of us were taught. Now, here's where the story gets darker, because everything covered so far only describes one category of tlacotin. There was a second, and it operated by entirely different rules. War captives. Sahagún and Diego Durán, another Spanish chronicler working from indigenous sources, both describe captured warriors as a distinct class, separate from debt slaves or famine slaves in both status and fate. Many captured warriors were destined for ritual sacrifice, offered to sustain what Aztec cosmology understood as the ongoing balance between gods and the human world. This is where the evidence gets harder to pin down precisely. Some sources suggest sacrifice was reserved primarily for captured warriors rather than civilian populations, while the exact scope and frequency remain debated among historians working from fragmentary and sometimes contradictory colonial-era accounts. What's established is that war captives and tlacotin were treated as legally and socially distinct categories, even though Spanish translators often collapsed, both under the single word slave. So when we talk about Aztec slavery, we're really describing at least two different systems that happen to share one label in translation, and that mistranslation has caused confusion for 500 years. Physically, tlacotin were identifiable in specific ways. Those being sold in the market, or those who had violated the terms of their servitude, wore a wooden collar, sometimes with a long attached staff designed to make running difficult. Clothing was plain, undyed maguey fiber, marking status at a glance in a society that used color and material to signal rank constantly. Certain merchants, the porteca, specialized specifically in the slave trade, and particular markets in the empire became known centers for exactly this kind of transaction. And death didn't necessarily end the relationship the way you'd expect. When an owner died, tlacotin, who had given years of loyal service, were often freed outright as a final act, according to Durán's accounts. The rest were passed down as part of the inheritance, like any other property, which is a stark reminder that, whatever protections existed, this was still, fundamentally, a system where human beings could be legally owned. That tension sits at the center of everything historians still debate about this institution. Was it slavery, in any meaningful sense, if the enslaved could own property, marry freely, and buy their own freedom back? Or does the simple fact of being ownable, tradable, and inheritable make the comparatively humane treatment beside the point? There's no consensus answer, and that's honestly the most intellectually honest place to leave it. The evidence supports real legal protections that most slave systems in history never offered. The evidence also supports real human suffering, families torn apart by famine, people wearing collars in a public market, children sold to strangers because there was nothing left to eat. What happened to this entire system is its own story. Spanish colonization dismantled Aztec slavery within decades, replacing it with encomienda labor, and, eventually, the transatlantic system that would come to define slavery in the Americas for the next 3 centuries. The tlacotin institution simply vanished from the historical record, its complexity flattened into a single word Europeans thought they already understood. Maybe that's the real mystery here. Not how the Aztecs treated the people in bondage, but how completely that system's actual nuance got erased the moment outsiders started describing it in their own language. If you'd been standing in that market in 1454, watching a mother count her children and decide which ones she couldn't afford to keep, what would you have made of a system built with that much protection and that much cruelty living side by side? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe for more documentaries that take Aztec history seriously enough to get it right.